Hi, this is Professor JPS, and this is a lecture for Communication Arts 101, Section 1. This is a substitute for Monday, September the 28th, 2020. This is a lecture for Chapter 12, the film unit, the film movies unit out of Chapter 12 out of the textbook. Out of all the chapters in the textbook, I'm relying less on the textbook and more on some notes that I've been able to utilize for many years as a professor of communication and also professor of film studies and film analysis. So the first thing I want to mention to you that the outline for this particular unit or chapter has already been posted on Blackboard. It's chapter 12, but again, there's less from the actual chapters, the actual pages from that chapter than any other textbook. We're relying primarily on the information on that outline. So what I'm going to speak about today, I'm doing this on Thursday, the week prior, but this is what you'll be watching for class on Monday. It's the same information that's in the Blackboard outline for Chapter 12, Blackboard in course content, okay? So primarily, I just want to speak about film. And I want to speak about cinema in general. So I think that while you're watching this lecture, it may benefit you to hit pause once in a while, to not be so bored by my droning on and on and on. Hit pause, go grab a drink, have a cup of coffee or what have you, and come back and just try to align your notes with the outline that comes later. But I want to just talk a little bit about motion pictures. If you think about other areas of study in the arts, if you think about literature, if you think about painting, if you think about architecture, if you think about classical music and other art forms which have been around for centuries and centuries and centuries and have been studied at colleges and universities for, many years, if not hundreds of years, at different universities. And if you compare that to film or cinema, film and cinema is really still the new kid on the block. Motion pictures themselves are not really that old. They've only been around since 1895. So in terms of trying to think about how we study film from a variety of perspectives, it can be commercial interest, industrial commercial interests, it can be aesthetic or artistic interests, it can have to do with political economy, it can also have to do with just how it is that it influences other media. But film is very powerful, more powerful than we realize. Now, in the time of COVID, cinema has really been somewhat troubling because there are some movie theaters that are open, but not so many people have been going to movie theaters because it's generally a pretty dangerous thing to do, to stay indoors for that long and breathe the same air that other people are breathing. But movies will come back, and we will be able to freely go to the cinema one of these days. Anyway, what I'm trying to get at is there's really very little question that motion pictures were the most popular art form, popular culture art form of the 20th century. Excuse me. Pardon me. Sorry about that. Motion pictures were certainly the most popular, populist art form of the 20th century. It's amazing how powerful motion pictures were, how many people went to see them. And even though motion pictures themselves are not that old if you compare them to other arts, they've had a very powerful influence in the way in which we understand the world, more so than I think we realize. And what I'd like to do now is just talk a little bit about the history of motion pictures in America. And you'll see this also reinforced in the course outline. So motion pictures get started in the latter part of the 19th century. 1895 is when Thomas Edison finally has his motion picture camera and motion picture projector ready to go. And there are two main places where motion pictures get started in the West. One is France, in Paris, and one is in New York and New Jersey. Well, they're two places, but you know what I mean, the East Coast. And this is an intro class in mass communications, so I'll leave the Parisian stuff alone and just concentrate on the American stuff. So in 1895, motion pictures as such were not like we understand movies to be. They were kind of like a quirky, almost like an arcade game that people would go to see, this newfangled medium called motion pictures. There were no movie theaters as such. There were just storefronts, and they would put a sheet up on a wall, and they would have this small film projector projecting images through a light on a screen. And just the very fact of a moving image was captivating to audiences in 1895. And I kind of break it down into three particular categories in those years. 1895 to about 1905. 1895 to about 1905 were the first representations of cinema in America. And primarily, all they were just moving images up on a screen, for the most part. I mean, some of the first films are made are called, workers leaving a factory. And it's, a 2-minute long movie, and it's just workers leaving a factory. Or a train arriving at a station. It's just a train arriving at a station on an angle, right? In other words, audiences were captivated primarily just by the moving image itself, right? I mean, photography itself isn't even that old, but then photography suddenly in a darkened room on a wall with a projector projecting light and image up on a wall, it had the illusion of motion. It was very, very captivating. It was very, very powerful. But it's not like movies started with 3-hour, adventure stories. They were just showing the world around it in two-dimensional reality, and it was very, very vibrant for audiences. It was very, very surprising for audiences that they could see this thing called a moving image. And the first movie theaters were called Nickelodeons because they cost a nickel to get into. And the first movie theater audiences, in America primarily, were working people and poor people and immigrants and undereducated people, right? It was cheap, it was only a nickel, and the market for it, the demographic for it, were poor people, working people, and immigrants. And the venues for the places were just like arcades. They were just small storefronts. There was no movie theaters. The first movie theaters referred to as Nickelodeons because they didn't have movie theaters yet. And in those first, say, 7 to 10 years, it was just a kind of reformation of trying to get images up on the screen and to get some sense of this newfangled medium that was kind of captivating. The next sort of portion is 1905 to 1910, in and around there. I mean, these aren't exact dates, they're approximations. But 1905 to 1910, what you start to have is the development of narrative storytelling. And the narrative storytelling really starts to come through with filmmakers trying to utilize editing for the first time. So in other words, prior to this time period, it was just images on a screen. And then they started to sort of come away with the notion that maybe they would tell stories. Well, how do they tell stories? Well, they have to edit. Well, what's going to make sense? How does shot A link up with shot B? And how does shot B link up with shot C? And how does a sequence work? And will audiences understand? Right? Remember, it's a brand new medium. And so in that period, the next period, 1905 to roughly 1910, you have this development of stories where they have shorter films. I mean, the films are pretty short, 10, 12, 15 minutes. But they start to actually have little dopey stories, little comedies, little romances, little melodrama things. And one shot leads to the next shot and leads to the next shot. So there's a real development of style by learning how to edit properly. I don't know if any of you have ever made films. It's hard. It's hard to actually link shots together to make the whole film make sense. Remember, they didn't know what audiences would understand. They started to do pretty well. Those nickels started to add up to real dollars. And again, this is all on the East Coast. No one's ever even heard of Hollywood yet. This is New York primarily, New Jersey, and they start springing up in other eastern seaboard towns like Philadelphia and Baltimore and Atlanta and Boston and so forth. Early cinema, primarily relatively poor, primarily in storefronts, and primarily pretty basic. The next period, the third one, 1910 to about 1915, represents a pretty big leap for the motion picture producers, because what they started to develop in this particular period was called the star system. Motion picture producers, now that they started to get stories and genres under their belt, they thought, well, let's try to entice some Broadway actors or known actors. When the Broadway actors at first just thought of movies as this sort of stupid arcade thing that would not amount to anything. But then they started to get paid some decent money to star in these movies, and movies started to get longer, like 20 minutes and half an hour, 45 minutes. And they started to have famous Broadway actors and actresses. And they started to actually make attractive women and attractive men on the screen become the heroes and heroines of movies. And once they started to do that, they started to attract a more middle and upper middle class audience. In other words, it became acceptable to be seen going to movie theaters, right? And once that started to happen, the movie producers on the East Coast started to build not just storefronts, but actual gigantic, plush, big movie palace theaters. I mean, beautiful theaters in New York, I mean, 10 or 15 big ones right in Manhattan. Huge 1,000-seat arenas that would have a huge screen and plush, beautiful chairs to sit in and velvet ropes to go around. Once the upper to middle and upper middle classes started to go to the, quote, movies, it really made a good deal of money. So the early going was just, the first thing was just images on a screen. The second thing was development of narrative and through editing and trying to get editing to work so stories could be made. And then the star system allowed for a big growth in middle class audiences and more money for the studios, the early studios. So that's just a basic description of cinema, roughly speaking, on the East Coast between 1895 and 1915, roughly speaking, okay? These things are reiterated in your course outline. What then happens is that the movie producers have a good idea. Instead of staying in New York City and in and around the East Coast, they decide to go 3,000 miles away to Los Angeles, California, and try to set up shop in Los Angeles, California. In and around 1915, that's roughly the period that most of the movie producers go there. They go there for two main reasons, okay? The one main reason, which is hard to believe by today's standards, is that there was cheap real estate. It's almost impossible for us to ever think that Southern California once had cheap real estate. But at the beginning of the 20th century, 1915, not that many people lived in California. It was a growing state, and it was a pretty sparsely populated state. In fact, Hollywood, the neighborhood in Los Angeles, was known then for its lemon groves and its orange groves. There was no Hollywood there to speak of in around this time period. I mean, no filmmaking to speak of in this time period. So when the movie producers come from the New York area, New Jersey area, to Southern California, it's essentially virgin territory, and they buy up lots of land to then build their studio space on. It was one of the greatest investments in the history of economics in American life. They're still there, right? Paramount Pictures is still there where they bought it in around 1910 or 1912 or whatever it was. And they're enormous tracts of land. And all in these places, the 5 major and 3 minor studios, all around Los Angeles and different parts of Los Angeles, we roughly call it Hollywood, but they're all over different neighborhoods of Los Angeles, are the studios. And they're just enormous. And there's sound stages and backlots and dressing places and places for the cameras to be stored, the equipment. It's an enormous factory. And it was bought pretty cheaply. And then the other key reason that they leave from New York to the Los Angeles area is because of a dual reason: climate and topography. Climate and topography. Climate, you can understand, it's about 78 to 92 degrees every day in Los Angeles. Okay, it's dry, it's not that humid, and the weather's beautiful. The other thing is topography is just a fancy word for the lay of the land. In other words, there's lots of different places in Los Angeles that you can, or near Los Angeles, that you can utilize for films, because you have the city itself. You can shoot in an urban area. The mountains are only about an hour, maybe 2 hours away tops. The ocean is right there as well. The desert is right there as well. And you have the studio if none of those things work. So it's 78 degrees just about every day, or 90 up to 90 degrees, although it's hotter now. And you have all of these other kinds of areas surrounding Los Angeles that make up its topography that allows for many more ways to shoot films. So once the studio bosses sort of planted their flag in Southern California, it was really a smart investment, because they had a lot of space to build their studios, and they could do all the things they wanted to do indoors. And if they wanted to go outdoors, it's much easier to do that in California than it was in New York, where it's pretty cold, and at least 6 months a year, more like 7 months a year, it's pretty cold. So once they're in Los Angeles and they start to make films, they come up with something that's very, very vital and very, very important, that lays the foundation for the overwhelming success of the Hollywood film industry. Okay? And that thing is called vertical integration. Vertical integration. Vertical integration. Okay? This is also in your outline. Vertical integration is the complete ownership of production, distribution, and exhibition of movies. Okay? This is, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the most important factor in the formation of the Hollywood studio system. And it's an economic formation. It's an economic reason for the overwhelming success of the Hollywood industry. Because what this did is it set up a vertically integrated system where they own the production facilities. That is to say, they own the studio space where the films were made, and all the camera equipment, right? And all the actors. They had them on 7-year contracts, and all the directors. The directors worked like dogs. They really worked a lot. It was like a factory. It was like a warehouse and factory and assembly line. Then they own the distribution houses. Now, the distribution houses are just offices all around the country that get the films, literally the films themselves that you have to put on a projector. They get them from Los Angeles and get them to the city or town near you, right? And then they own the exhibition houses, which is just a fancy word for movie theater. So they own the production facilities. They own the middleman, which is the distribution house. The distribution house, again, is a place where the product is held until it's actually given to the public. And when it's given to the public, it's at a movie theater. They own the movie theaters. They own their own movie theaters. The 5 majors and 3 minor studios had a kind of collective monopoly on this particular product. And it was the key reason for the overwhelming success of the Hollywood industry, what's called the Hollywood Golden Age of cinema. It starts right around 1915 and ends roughly about the late 50s or about 1960. But it's because it was a monopoly. They owned the production houses, and they own the distribution houses, and they own the exhibition houses. And exhibition is just a fancy word for movie theater, right? So virtually every film they made a profit, because there was nothing to compete with it other than the other studio. So one studio might do a little better one year than the next, but the 5 major and 3 minor studios essentially had the entire market to themselves and had a lack of competition. Now remember, guys, this is a long time ago. There's no Snapchat at this time, right? There's no TikTok at this time, right? There's no Instagram. There's no Facebook, right? There's no television in 1915. There's no radio in 1915. Radio doesn't come into American homes really until the 20s. So there's a lack of competition for entertainment. People went to the movies all the time in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s, and even into the 50s, right? It's not till television comes along in the early to mid 1950s and draws some of the audience away from films. But movies made so much, or the studios, I should say, made so much money in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and into the 50s. And it was primarily because of this thing called vertical integration. The ownership, the complete ownership of production, distribution, and exhibition, okay? That makes a great deal of money. Another reason for the overwhelming success of the Hollywood film industry is something called the development of genre, okay? The development of genre. Genre is type or category of film. Motion picture producers and directors were smart enough not to just limit themselves in how many genres or subgenres they would contribute to the culture. They wanted to reach a widest audience as possible. So they developed genres. Not only did they develop genres within their own genre, like did better on gangster films or whatever, but they would make adventure films, they would make crime stories, they would make other kinds of dramas, they would make romances, they would make adventure films. Did I say adventure films? They would make horror films, they would make film noir, they would make documentary, they would make all kinds of different genres, right? I mean, you don't like the same kind of movies your Aunt Sally likes, but Aunt Sally's money is as green as yours, you know what I mean? So when they developed genres and subgenres, they expanded the audience. They allowed for audiences to be reached that otherwise hadn't been reached yet. Okay, so it's hard to put into a kind of words. Like in your day, in your generation, social media is the thing that you return to almost automatically. In a slower 1930s, even when there was a depression on, people still went to the movies almost out of a national habit. They would lay their 15 cents down or something, 20 cents maybe, and they would see a movie all the time. Even during the Depression, movies did well. The two main reasons the move for Hollywood was climate and topography, and climate, topography, and cheap real estate, two and one half, you know what I mean? But the two main reasons for the overwhelming success of the Hollywood film industry is vertical integration and development of genre, okay? And then vertical integration starts to fall by the wayside, okay? So America gets through the Depression, and then America gets through World War II. World War II ends in first May of 1945, and then for good in August of 1945. And a few years later, there is a lawsuit that reaches the Supreme Court. And in that lawsuit, it says that the motion picture industry has developed a monopoly, and therefore it's unfair. And what happens in 1948 is the Supreme Court rules vertical integration unconstitutional, which means that it's illegal, it's a monopoly, that they shouldn't have been getting away with that for all those years. And right away, what happens is the Supreme Court rules that the studios have to sell the movie theaters. They can no longer own the movie theaters outright. So once that happens, the movie theaters get sold, and they get sold to independent operators. So what used to be a kind of A, B, C, all the way down the line, perfect symmetry of vertical integration, now stops between production and distribution. It goes from production to distribution and stops at the distribution level. The distributor now has to bargain with the independent movie theater owner. So right away, they're starting to lose profits. Now, at the same exact time, in the late 40s and early 50s, television starts to come into being in American life. They start broadcasting from New York City in 1948. Now, you may think of television and film as kind of together, kind of in the same ballpark, which in some ways they are today, but not back then. Television was a separate animal. Television was a kind of outgrowth of radio and theater. It was a New York City thing primarily, although television popped up all over. But primarily it was broadcast out of New York City. And movie studio owners were worried about television because they were thinking, why would people want to come out to the movies if they can watch stuff on television? Plus, they're dealing with this lawsuit that says they can't own their movie theaters anymore. So it's a real problem for motion pictures. Television, on one hand, is taking their audience away, and their audience has already been shrunk by litigation regarding the monopolistic principles. The Supreme Court ruled, it was called the Paramount decision. The Paramount decision, and this is also in your outline on Blackboard. So this is a problem for Hollywood. At the height of the golden age of the Hollywood cinema, 90 million people a week went to the movies. That's an astonishing number. 90 million people a week. 90 million. With losing the Supreme Court battle and with television taking some of their audience away, by 1955, that number is down to 16 million. So by the mid-1950s, the Hollywood movie industry does not know what it's going to do. So they have an answer. They try to answer to get audiences to come back to movie theaters. This is also in your outline. And there's just a couple of goofy things that they do. They try to develop drive-ins to get mainly teenagers to get out of the house to come see movies and have a social time of it. They also develop something called Smell-O-Vision, which you'd get a scratch and sniff card with numbers on it when you went to the movie theater. And then, you know, in a film, would say a woman would came by with a bouquet of flowers, a number would pop up on the screen, like number 1, and you would scratch number 1 and you'd sniff like flowers or something. And then later on, like, I don't know, if a dog pooped or something, you would scratch and it's supposed to smell like dog poop. It was kind of a silly thing. There was another one called Psycho-Rama, which it was almost sort of like a kind of strange psychology game where if a film was about, say, romance or something and a man was kissing a woman, the word lust would pop up on the screen a couple times. Or if a guy was fighting another guy, blood would pop up on the screen. It was just a kind of freak show to get audiences out there. Also in the 50s, there were a lot of very lengthy, epic-like films, a lot of religious films, like Ben-Hur, and The Robe, and 10 Commandments, and The Greatest Story Ever Told, and films about Christ a lot, or biblical films. And there were a lot of very wide screen formats that were happening in the 1950s. These were all essential attempts to try to get audiences out of their living rooms to stop watching television and get them back to the movie theaters. It worked a little bit here and there, but nothing was very, very sustained. By the early 1960s, the Hollywood film industry was in a lot of peril. They just didn't have enough money that they used to have, and they were still acting like they had that money. A lot of the studio chiefs were in their 50s and 60s, and they thought that they could turn it around somehow. They always did. But what they're forgetting is that they had vertical integration back then. They had a gravy train from one step to the next. They had a monopoly on this industry. They no longer had that. But a strange and interesting thing started to happen in the mid-1960s, independent of the Hollywood studios, and that is the 1960s. The countercultural revolution, the Vietnam War, and the rising up against the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, the burgeoning gay rights movement, the feminist rights movements. A lot of the baby boom generation was coming of age and thinking they wanted to change things. There was a great deal of change in the 60s. And filmmaking also became part and parcel of that change. There was a saying about people who were artistic in the 20s and 30s, they wanted to write the great American novel. But by the 60s, they wanted to make the great American film. And an interesting thing starts to happen. Young people, primarily men, start to get to make quirky, different kinds of films in the mid-60s, and suddenly these kinds of films catch on with that same audience who's part of the, quote, 60s rock and roll hippie generation, okay? So the old studio heads who were at least 30 years older than these people, who were starting to make interesting, dynamic, somewhat anti-establishment films, they were really, really thrown off by this. And they thought, well, why do you people want to watch these kind of dopey movies? And for some reason, it struck a chord with the young people. So through the 60s, there was a lot of hit and miss films, and Hollywood could never really stabilize in terms of its economic prowess. And it was really anxious about what it was going to do economically. But almost ironically, what happened is the young people started to make intriguing films. The film called Easy Rider, which is a really big hippie film. It's about two young guys, Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda, who right at the beginning of the movie they buy drugs. I think it's either cocaine or heroin. I can't tell. It's just a white powder over the Mexican border. And they come over with the money, and ostensibly they sell it to somebody. And they make a great deal of money. And they get on their motorcycles and they go from Los Angeles to New Orleans for Mardi Gras. And the movie has a lot of downer moments in it, and it has a kind of immediacy of the time period, and it has a hippie aesthetic. They have real long hair. They smoke a lot of pot in the movie. They have some sex in the movie. It's disjointed. The camera shoots into the sun a lot of times. It's but it cleaned up. It made like $50 million when movies only cost about a couple bucks to go to the movies, and it only cost like, I don't know, $100,000 to make. And the bosses back at the studios were like, why did that weirdo hippie movie make all this money? They didn't see that the times themselves were changing, and that young filmmakers were trying to reflect that change with cinema, with movies. And then you start to get some interesting filmmakers in the late 60s and early 70s. People like Robert Altman, people like Francis Ford Coppola, people like George Lucas, people like Brian De Palma, people like Woody Allen, people like William Friedkin, some very, very intriguing movie makers. And Hollywood starts to do a little bit better economically. And then suddenly, a movie's made about the mafia based upon a best-selling book by a pretty young movie maker named Francis Ford Coppola, and that movie is The Godfather, and it becomes the highest-grossing film of all time. And then Hollywood starts to sort of get back into its economic fortunes again. And then 3 years later, a nice Jewish boy from Arizona by the name of Steven Spielberg makes a movie about a shark, and that becomes the highest grossing film of all time in 1975, Jaws. And then the nerdiest of nerdy men, who takes a science fiction idea, well, he steals a Japanese movie called The Hidden Fortress and puts it into outer space instead with some young sexy stars. And that movie called Star Wars then becomes the highest grossing film of all time. So in like between 72 and 77, the blockbuster mentality took over, and Hollywood was back where it had been earlier, years and years ago. It had made a tremendous amount of money, and it was really the era of the filmmaker who was relatively young and tapping into something that was cultural. It never happened before nor since. Oh, by the way, if you're interested in 60s and early 70s films, I'm teaching a film class next semester called Communication Arts 257, American Film Heritage. That's ComArts 257, American Film Heritage. It's all about films of that groovy peace, love, and understanding, smoking dope and having premarital sex years of the 60s. And all these interesting filmmakers will go over and talk about the text and context of 60s films. That's Com 257, American Film Heritage. Ask for it by name. Anyway, back to the lecture. So, roughly speaking, between about 1965 and 1980 is a really interesting artistic period for American movies. You have movies that don't have happy endings. You have leading men who aren't necessarily perfectly handsome. You have leading ladies who aren't necessarily, the most beautiful. I mean, they're all still good looking. It's not like there's a bunch of uggos on the screen. But what I'm getting at is the glamour was not quite there. And there was a real feel for realism, to try to reflect things the way they were rather than to pretend. And it caught on with audiences. And cinema itself caught on as a kind of intellectual fervor in America during the latter 60s and early 70s. Movies seemed to matter in the culture back then. They really did. How movies matter today, I don't know. They matter as franchises. They matter what's going to happen at Comic-Con. But movies then in the late 60s and early 70s, they seemed to be rising to the art form that they could be. And what was interesting is they were doing well economically too. And Hollywood itself was much more stabilized, much more, as they say, in the black, which means profitable. In the red means you're not profitable, and the black means you are profitable. And that blockbuster mentality moved us all the way up into the early to mid 80s. Now, some of the more interesting films and, artful films started to diminish by the early 80s, right? What happens in the early 80s also helps Hollywood in a number of ways. There's a couple of things, and this is all, again, in your outline. One are sequels. It's amazing how many sequels were made in the 80s and into the 90s. There's still sequels all the time, right? And what's the basic element of a sequel? Well, you're just repeating what you did the first time with a slightly different plot, so audiences can go back and get that expectations satisfied. Lots of sequels really start in the latter 70s and early 80s. Cable television. You may think that cable television has always been around, but it hasn't been. Cable television really took off in the country in the 1980s. So if you're a Hollywood studio and you have all these movies in your library that you used to show in movie theaters that aren't any good for you anymore, you can now put them on cable television. You can sell them to HBO and make more money. And that's what they did. And that's what they're still doing, right? HBO and then later Showtime and Starz or whatever the other cable networks are. So cable television becomes a new home for films that have already been seen. Next is the development of VHS and then later DVD. You guys are probably just barely old enough to remember VHS, but VHS was a very big deal. The very idea that you could have a videotape version of a movie in your hands that you could watch in your home was extraordinary back in, say, 1982 or 3 or 4 or 5. And if you're a Hollywood studio, again, you have a backlog of all these old movies, you turn them into cheap videotapes, and you're reselling the 20th century again. Extraordinarily profitable for the Hollywood industry in the 1980s. You have cable television, development of VHS, then later DVD, the same idea, it's just DVD. You're reselling your products over and over and over again. Plus, you're giving more life to the feature films that you show. You put a summer movie out, Friday the 13th, Part 7, right? And then it comes out on video in the fall. The extended life is longer, right? And then that gets shown on HBO in the Christmas time or whatever. And then the life of the film is much longer. It makes much more money over that time period. Hollywood became so successful by the late 80s and early 90s that what happens in the late 80s and early 90s is larger media corporations buy up the studios. And they just use the studios as part of one of their pieces of ammunition to try to get to the public. So in other words, Paramount Pictures was a big, successful studio for 80 years, making films, and then also making some television deals later. Now they're part of a large corporation called Viacom, and Viacom owns not only Paramount, but it owns CBS Television, and it owns record labels, and it owns magazines, and it owns web properties. So the studios themselves are just pieces of ammunition for the larger media companies. The larger media companies have bought all of the studios by the early to mid 1990s, and they're still working that way. Disney owns Fox now. Disney owns all kinds of stuff. AOL Time Warner is owned by AOL. Time and Warner Brothers are together, right? So they're selling all across the board. They're selling not only movies, but television and radio and magazines and web properties and so forth and so on. Motion pictures are very, very powerful things. They're also pretty psychological. Think about it, right? What are movies? Movies are this weird experience. You go into a large room with strangers in the dark, and up on the screen with light hitting the screen and images flickering, and together you're experiencing something for the first time with a bunch of different people. Now you can do that in music, and you can do that in the theater, and you can do that in other art forms. But the thing about cinema is it's so powerful because it's so psychological. And I think that what we understand about cinema is less than we realize, because it's very powerful as portraying as to what life could be or should be. And I think that if you really see a very fine film, you could become the protagonist of your own life in ways that you can't with other media. That's what I like about movies. Movies are very powerful, but they can teach you to become the protagonist of your own life. They can do two things so well. One of them is they can take you to places you've never seen before, right? In a fantasy way. Movies are really great that way. But the other thing that's, I think, even more powerful is it can show something that is so true and so identifiable to every one of us that we can feel a sense of truth that we don't get from other media. That's my pitch about films. Okay? Just in terms of the history of cinema, I just want you to keep in mind some of the things I said tonight. I try not to go on too long. All of it is in the outline, so it might be worthy for you to look at the outline and then listen to me blather on a little bit to see where I've discussed it and noted it, okay? We will be back in regular classroom time Wednesday, the 30th of September. And if you have any questions or comments, just email me. I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. I am busy with my 3 other classes as well. I thank you for your attention to this YouTube channel. I will remind you that this is on Blackboard that this is up. And have a good day. And we will speak about this lecture on Wednesday the 30th. And take care.